Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. Both alike are concerned with such things as come, more or less, within the general ken of all men, and belong to no definite science. Accordingly, all men make use, more or less, of both. For to a certain extent, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. Ordinary people do this either at random or through practice and from acquired habit. Both ways being possible, the subject can plainly be handled systematically, for it is possible to inquire the reason why some speakers succeed through practice and others spontaneously. And everyone will at once agree that such an inquiry is the function of an art. Those familiar with the writings of Aristotle will recognize this as the opening lines to his book called Rhetorica or Rhetoric. And that is, and Aristotle being one of the sort of founding philosophers in many ways of the Western tradition, even though that's people who are familiar with the history of philosophy might cringe a little bit of that. We very oftentimes go back to Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and not too often go back before that if we're following the Greek tradition. Exceptions may apply. And rhetoric is the subject of today's episode. We are on episode 90 of the Redacted Culture Cast. It's crazy to see how far we've come. We are thankful for the time that you have spent with us. And we are going to put this out here. Let me click the correct button. What you're seeing is a little bit of the back end of, if you're on YouTube, what you're seeing is a little bit of the back end of our presence at redactedculture.locals.com, where we provide some sneak peeks, some first advance notices on some things coming out or down the pipeline. But also, I like to host discussions, have conversations about very specific books, and we're looking to expand this into having, for members who want to support the show, question and response videos specifically directed towards you. Mind you, if you're going to ask a question and you're going to be able to post it on the member side, I am much more likely to be able to get a longer form or quicker response on that page, so long as I have Wi-Fi. But that being the case, I want to open this up and invite you guys to head over to redactedculture.locals.com, where you can support the show, keep us going. In addition to that, we do have some of the Cabin in the Woods Season 1, Operation 1 merch available on the website. That is the overstock from last year. When it's gone, it really is gone. So if you want to start keeping up with the collection, if you want to make sure you have all of the elements of Season 1, that's where you're going to find it. We'll see where we're going from there. The Operation shirts are the only ones with the hidden messages inside the back of the shirt, but that is for you to figure out. Good luck with that. But no, let's get on to the show. So the title of today is Rhetoric or Rhetoric and Reason, and the reason why we're talking about rhetoric, if that wants to be a tongue twister, is because I think the term rhetoric itself and the subject of this material oftentimes is considered a material that is the domain of philosophy, while not entirely fitting in. You might want to say that rhetoric itself is, or we'd have to start by defining rhetoric, is actually how we would go. Now, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines rhetoric as the art of persuasive speaking or writing. And if we wanted to look at this in a perhaps more valuable way of thinking, let's just dial back. Merriam-Webster refers to it as the art of persuasive speaking or writing. And I think in our day and age, we would want to maybe consider replacing the word art with skill, because in the postmodern and or secular age that we live in today, we tend to attribute personal expression or self-expression to something referred to as art, whereas skill tends to be something that one can practice or become good at. You can become skilled at things without deliberate practice, but maybe not reach the same height. And so when we're going to refer to rhetoric, we're going to refer to rhetoric as the skill of persuasive speaking or writing. Now, Aristotle, in his book, Rhetoric, does make an important distinction right off the bat, and that is the difference between a dialectic and a rhetoric, or difference between dialectic and rhetoric. Rhetoric is referred to as, he refers to as skill in public speaking. And then dialectic would be skill in formal debate. There's a footnote in the edition that I have right here. I'm going to show it. It's the basic works of Aristotle by the Modern Library Classics, the ones you find in Barnes and Noble. I got it, as you can see, at like a half-price bookstore. But on page 1325, which is the first page of Rhetorica, we have the first footnote. Rhetoric and dialectic may be roughly Englished as the art of public speaking and the art of logical discussion. So if rhetoric is public speaking, dialectic is logical discussion. And Aristotle goes on very quickly to explain how we understand through studying the subject of rhetoric that there are different ways of convincing people to do different things or to think certain ways. There's arguments from emotion, arguments from authority, and many of these things sound very quickly like logical fallacies because, in a sense, they are. However, while the Enlightenment may have been super interested, that's really bad English for me. While the Enlightenment may have placed a greater emphasis on logic than on emotion, or the followers or people who are familiar with Ben Shapiro might say, facts don't care about your feelings. We've recognized that worldview, that shortness of perspective to think that everything can be accomplished or seen through a logical lens, doesn't really correlate very well to reality. It doesn't actually seem to stick. In a sense, this has come up a couple different ways, whether it's in the sanction books or from people like Tim Pool and various other conversationalists. We find the issue that feelings don't really care about your facts either. And we as human beings are more than purely rational objects, enter in the caricature of the purely logical but emotionally void individual. And we are more than purely emotional people. Enter in the child who can only be happy or throw a tantrum, but for no reason whatsoever. He just is, or the alcoholic who's just pulled by his emotions all the time. You have this example that we have this understanding as we kind of pull back a little bit and start recognizing that though we may want to develop certain skill sets better, we are neither completely one or the other. We're neither completely emotional or logical. Those two things are going to be intertwined as we go. And so Aristotle makes the argument, he uses an example of how there are places, however, where we do not want certain forms of rhetoric, or we do not want rhetoric to have any place in our decision making. And he uses a court of law. And in recent history in the United States, we can see where this may or may not have played out, and that we can see where even individuals have utilized what is understood as rhetoric in an arena where where dialectic or where logic is supposed to be in charge. And the court of law is always a good example. Take the actions of a certain Ben Crump during the pseudo trial of a certain Derek Chauvin in Minnesota. Regardless of what your opinion is on the outcome of the trial, one thing that can be understood is that in some ways, the people interested in a certain outcome of the trial produced an environment that motivated the jurors to make a decision motivated the jurors or convinced the jurors to make their decision a certain way through something that wasn't within the courts itself or wasn't appropriate to the courts. And that would be you're rioting, you're looting, you're burning, you're also threats of violence, and so on and so forth. This is what Aristotle's exact words is: it is not right to pervert the judge by moving him to anger, envy, or pity. So now we might have to ask the question rather quickly, by what standard, but I want to stick to the subject of rhetoric. Rhetoric as a philosophical term when we think about rhetoric and when we think about it in regards to gun culture or the United States or the world as we stand in, very, very quickly we might jump to political arguments. We may jump to uh, movements, activism. As I'm recording, it's the 1st of June. We're looking at the effectiveness of the LGBTQ rhetoric to convince corporations and companies and elements of the population to support a cause that in many ways is just as vague as is that of many religions for that standard. But what you deal with here and what we deal with in this problem is that, is that when we look at the landscape of political debate, let's just use one that's closer to home on this podcast as the gun control debate, is that the rhetoric that is used to convince people to vote a certain way, perhaps even against their goodwill, is not necessarily arguments that belong within a logical framework. They are arguments of emotion. They could go so far as to lying or misleading subjects. And mind you, I think classifying lying as a method of rhetoric would be technically correct, but a little bit disingenuous. Um, and what we see here in the terms of rhetoric, or I'm sorry, and what we see here in this level of the conversation is that you oftentimes see, for those of us who exist within gun culture, a certain rationalism that's presented in defense of what we would call human rights or the Second Amendment, and those logical arguments are oftentimes met not with opposing but also logical arguments. Logic meaning they have some sort of functioning mechanism of truth discerning or truth statements. Rather, they're emotional appeals to people's better senses or whatever it is, and that emotional appeal. Um, Perhaps is very good at hiding the hook behind it, or hiding the. It's like a fishing lure. It's a really nice looking emotion, but inside it there's a very very deeply barbed hook. And we'll get to the trap in a second. And so what you run into is you run into a problem on the ground level of the gun control debate, and that is rhetoric is used. Is that one side of the argument appears to be approaching it with dialectic, and the other side of the argument seems to be approaching it with rhetoric, trying to convince you. Rhetoric's primary goal is not necessarily to find out what is true, but it is to produce an outcome. In that sense, it's trying to convince people. And dialectic, according to Aristotle in this case, is about according to Aristotle in this case, is about a logical discussion, and we'll have to get into dialectic in the future. But what it needs to be understood here, and what needs to come out of this is let's start with here. When you hear the term rhetoric, think of it as a method of convincing somebody. It's broad. It's an intentionally broad definition, like the skill of persuading someone, the skill of persuasive speaking or writing. And where this does interact and come crashing through the world of philosophy is that we might start to look at what are the things that might make something, a method of speaking or writing, to be persuasive. If the person you are speaking to highly values reason, then presenting a reasonable argument would be a form of rhetoric. If the person you are speaking to highly values a feeling of safety, then you know what they're looking for. Now, for some of us, I believe this can sound extremely simple in definition, or in explanation, but really difficult in the real world. And I want to try to give a little bit of an example. And I want to do this by looking at, again, how we approach individuals that we know. So if I know, when I know, I don't, I want, well, first of all, we can throw out the mythological levels of what's it called? manipulation that tend to get a little bit Jedi mind tricky on people. And we can stick into something a little bit more meaningful, is that if I can identify what your values are, then I can appeal to those values. And some people wear their values on their sleeve and they're very public about them. And some people have values that are counter to what they say their values are. I might value, let's just say, um, equity or equality. I might value equality, but I'm advocating and constantly arguing for an unequal playing field. That would mean that you have to that would be a way of identifying that a person's values are different than what they say their values are. If I am a person who's constantly advocating for or challenging something, maybe if I'm a person who's constantly stealing from you, then what you might recognize, if you identify a person who's constantly stealing from you, then you can rightly understand that they don't hold the value of private property very highly because they keep stealing. If you recognize that a person keeps infringing on your rights, it's really hard to consider them a rights-based individual. They might actually consider authority and power as a value, but they're using the guise of rights to achieve it. So when we think about rhetoric, we are oftentimes quickly looking at something that comes across with extremely negative connotations. Every time we think of the word rhetoric, as we've been describing in this podcast, we think of rhetoric as something that somebody uses to manipulate or deceive, and that's not always the case. If you and I are going somewhere and we are making a decision, we're at an impasse as to a decision, and I know that you highly value time spent with your family, I will choose or motivate the option of those that we are looking at that will give you more time to spend with your family. And you can see this in the way that we build community. If we, if I, right now, and this is how you could even present the openness of rhetoric. If I recognize that we as a gun culture desire a presence of community, then I know and I recognize that it's a desire of us as individuals, then I can appeal to that without it being manipulative. Let's be very clear here. Not all forms of rhetoric are immorally manipulative. We need to understand that there is a line where it is, and sometimes we call that lying, sometimes we call that deception. But we also need to recognize that rhetoric itself is not purely a logical argument, and it's not purely a malicious tool. It is an amoral concept. It is how would I present a subject to you that is meaningful in some way? And how would I want to, if I'm speaking, and given this is a platform where I am quite literally publicly speaking right now, even though I'm sitting in my office talking to a camera, I recognize that there's somebody on the other side of that. And I know that I really do believe that in some forms, rhetoric has a value of appealing to our greatest values, our greatest morals, and our true desires. And it doesn't have to be malicious. So let's go back. Let's go back here to a little bit to turn from Aristotle to James Lindsey. Now, James Lindsey, many of us may be familiar with who James Lindsey is, and he kind of follows in the footsteps, sort of somebody like Jordan Peterson. But James Lindsey has made a name for himself as a avid anti-communist and a little bit more than just that. But he has recently released a short video talking about uh, this idea called the dialectic, and he's most likely, and from what I've listened to of him, almost certainly referring to the Hegelian dialectic, which is from Hegel, and now we're talking about a sort of almost like a metaphysical rule here that suggests that society changes by having a thesis, adopting, or then which develops an antithesis, which those two meet, conflict, and then eventually create a synthesis between the two, which becomes the new thesis. And this is a sort of evolutionary theory of how cultures develop. And you can see this in various different ways, and it seems to be quite convincing. But I wonder, and I need to do more research and study, and maybe even perhaps one of these days have a conversation with James Lindsey about it. Perhaps the use of the word dialectic is taking it in, needs to be determined to whether we're referring to a dialectic in the Hegelian sense or dialectic in the Aristotelian sense. And now you know how philosophers talk to each other. It's kind of painful. But I want to make a point is that we have, if we go back to Aristotle and we and we make a distinction, we take that distinction between dialectic and rhetoric, dialectic being skill in formal debate or skill in logical discussion, whereas rhetoric is skill in public speaking. And we start with that distinction. James Lindsey identifies that there is an objective of engaging in a dialectic that could there or that an objective in engaging in a dialectic might be to create the environment where rhetoric will be combined with something else to produce an outcome. To be clear, think of it this way. And he uses and this is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today, is because he brought up the idea, he brought up the reference of gun control as an example, and we're going to continue using that same case. I don't know if we're going to cite Robert Reich, but whatever. And I'd recommend giving it a listen. It's one of his shorts. I think it's called, let me look at it. I don't have the opportunity right now. But if I can remember. But he makes a comment about how there is a strategy that might be as he refers to, communist corporatist strategy, or that is to incite a conversation so that the person who incited it may gather information about the people he opposes. From an intelligence standpoint, this would make sense. Create a disturbance and observe your opponent's reaction. And a disturbance that you don't have to commit to would be ideal. And in the same way, when it comes to the rhetoric of conversations, what we see in especially the politics on gun culture, as demonstrated by James Lindsey in this example, is that the thing that happens is that a conversation will be started about gun culture that turns into, or that possesses the trappings, the image of being a dialectic. But the onset assumption is oftentimes grievously erroneous. And then that, although it looks like a dialectic, it looks like an opportunity for conversation between reasonable peoples, what you end up getting is a conversation that is a virtual gold mine of back and forth interactions between peoples, where the person observing this conversation can pick and choose subjects or statements made by people to then, let's just say, unethically attack them in a very public stance. Think of it this way. If you were to imagine a family kind of like the French court without the cool costumes, where they come in, they all spend time in the ballroom together, speaking to one another, but their words are never straightforward nor intentional. Rather, their words, the questions that they ask each other, are all intense at producing at getting a response from somebody. They're trying to, if I in this fictional world of the pseudo French court or a gossiping family, you are sitting there at the table, and somebody comes up to you, somebody you know to be a gossip, comes to ask you a question. It is important for you then to immediately recognize whether or not that person's question is genuine, or if they are trying to mine you for things to gossip about or things to get you in trouble with. If we're talking about the French Revolution, are you a what did they call it? It's not an aristocrat. It's a monarchist. Are you a monarchist or a Jacobin or a Girondin? These kind of things. This is this idea of think of it as in the case of the French court, the purpose of the question, or in the case of the gossiping family, the purpose of the question is not that you would answer it for their betterment, but that you would answer it and they could use your answer, twist it in a certain way to appeal to somebody else. So did you hear what They said, did you hear what? Oh, and you could even giggle a little bit this about gun culture. Oh, did you hear the salacious news about what Garand Thumb said about shotguns this weekend? And I know that's a super simplistic argument, but I mean, we're getting into an example here. And in a certain sense, we can make a very clear case here. Look, what's going on is that you're creating an opportunity for people to engage in a logical debate and conversation, but the real strategy, the intent is to open up by opening up a opportunity for logical debate, acquire, twist, and manipulate things that were stated into something else for the purpose of persuading people. Rhetoric's objective is persuasion. Dialectic's objective is reason, rationalism, truth seeking might be the way of saying it. And since we are human beings, we live in a world of both. But what's important to do, and what's important in this conversation, and why we even bring up the subject of rhetoric, is to be able to distinguish between when a method of speaking is a rhetorical strategy and when a method of speaking is a dialectic invitation, or an invitation to engage in the dialectic, or in dialectic, or in dialect, in conversation, in true, honest conversation. And so let's think of this as we're looking at this as a form of strategy. Rhetoric, if the objective of rhetoric is to persuade people, one method of persuading them might be to use the fallacy of an ad hominem. But it's not an ad hominem at the person you're engaging with. It's an ad hominem, attacking the character of a third person, a non-present third party, the opposition to your position. And so in order to gather the material to do this, what we would do is we would engage in the public discourse with a conversation that the individual has no intention of really getting to any conclusion through, but rather they create a conversation so that they may use that conversation to gather information that they may use against the person they were speaking against, perhaps even in a disingenuous or misleading way. An example of how we see this happen on the college campus, perhaps one of the most aggressive battlefields of reason in this day and age, is where you have students who very oftentimes identify as some form of communist will desire to engage in a conversation, and they'll host a debate or a conversation about something like guns. And they don't, whether or not they are morally capable or morally conscious enough to understand that they don't know the first thing about what they're talking about, they are desiring to produce a situation where people who they consider opponents will say things that they can use, twist out of proportion, to attack that person's position within the school. Think of it this way. You have a young student, a young activist student. Activist is not the right word. It's too charged, but not in the right direction. Think of it as you have a young intellectual terrorist who is present in your university. And that student will attempt to ask the professor questions and engage in a conversation with the professor. And when you and although the student may look earnest, their intent is in no way to get an answer, or their intent is in no way to really get their attempt is in no way really to solve that question. Their intent is to get the professor to say certain things that they can then use, maybe twist out of proportion a bit, and take it to the administration of the school and get the professor fired. If I don't want to pass a class, or if I want to pass a class but I don't want to do the work, might as well accuse the professor of doing something heinous, because then they'll be under investigation. And while he's under investigation, no one's going to look at the fact that I may or may not have done my job. I may or may not have taken my classes correctly or something like that. And this is a strategy that is oftentimes applied against people. Now, in conclusion, what is the solution? What is the solution to this great conversational problem that we deal with in our day and age? Well, the solution to rhetoric is to treat something for what it is, not for what it's implying it is. Treat something as what it is, not what it's trying to be. If a person is engaging in what they desire to be perceived as an intellectual conversation, but they're disdaining the rules of intelligent conversation, they should not be treated as participants in the conversation. If somebody wants to be a part of the club, but they disdain the rules of the club, then they should not be taken seriously as a prospective member. If you know, so the point there here is to recognize what you believe. The solution to bad rhetoric is not good logic, and that might throw some people off. The solution to malicious rhetoric, or effective but morally gray black, morally evil, morally wrong rhetoric, the solution to the use of rhetoric being used against you is to first and foremost know what you believe. If you do not know what you believe, then you will be easily convinced of most anything. And this is one of the greatest confusing moments of living in 2023, where we have grown up in a time where in many ways people wanted the outcome of belief, but not the action of belief. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. In fact, we want the outcome of, or we want the fruit that multiculturalism promises without the foundation that's necessary to produce it. We want to have the fruits of a rights-based economy or a rights-based country without upholding those rights in our courts of law. And when I say we, I'm not talking about random AGs in New York City who have decided that people do not have a right to self-defense, depending on their politically perceived outcome. No, I mean that for us here on the ground, us as Americans. The solution to this world that we live in, the solution to the use of rhetoric and a defense against it, as well as a way to use it in our own advantage, is to first and foremost know what you believe and why you believe it. This is the first window at what it means to be a critical thinker. It's not simply that you can claim that you think for yourself, but that you are capable of understanding how you think and perhaps even making adjustments to those. What is the mechanism of belief, or what is the mechanism of knowledge? That being, if that were the case, then so many of us who like to call ourselves free thinkers are really anything but. We're just wild automatons. That might be a fun way of putting it. We're going to get into that in another episode. But the first thing, know what you believe and why you believe it. And second, treat people for what they are. If they are gossips, recognize that they are gossips, that the questions that they're asking are not there for you. They are not presented so that you can answer them earnestly. They are presented so that you can set yourself up for their trap. If they are a liar, recognize that they do not suddenly become honest when talking about something that you are interested in. And that is how we deal with bad rhetoric. And as this goes forward, we might oftentimes, or we might be able to return to a certain, let's just call it perception that rhetoric has oftentimes in this environment, that a rhetorical debate or a conversation between two peoples is oftentimes thought of, or a formal debate is oftentimes thought of as some sort of chess game, where people are wielding modus ponens versus modus tollens and so on and so forth. And it's not exactly true. Rather, a true good conversation is focused at the objective of truth seeking. So if that's going to be the case, I suggest you reach out to your friends, go and find somebody. And if you want to engage in some good rhetoric, be very clear about your intentions and be clear with yourself about your intentions. If you want to engage with rhetoric, or if you want to engage in rhetoric with us over here at Redacted, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. And that's a horrible transition if there ever was one. That being the case, though, we are back in the saddle here, recording like crazy and hard at work, bringing you a good combination of gun culture and hard and rigorous philosophy. We'd like to thank you for the time that you spent with us, and we appreciate the amount of sharing this episode may get, or that you have done so with our podcast. My podcast, our podcast, however it goes. Pronouns are weird these days. Let's not get into it. That being the case, if you'd share the show with your friends, I'd really appreciate that. We are looking to continue growing. Of course, we want to grow, but I am optimistic that we are part of a you and I, me speaking, you listening, you and I engaging in conversation through different platforms. I believe that we are part of that change that we wanted to see in gun culture and in America as a whole. As people might believe that the world is falling apart, perhaps that's just the slow creep of decentralization, which in all provides a new opportunity for us to build from what we have left. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.